It's fun to get interviewed sometimes instead of being the one asking all the questions. So
Yeah,
I
yeah.
do look forward to these.
Cool. Do you have any questions for me before we start?
I watched the I watched the I watched the Peugeot video. That was interesting.
Yeah,
So no, let's go.
sure. Um, I guess first of all, could you talk a bit about your father being a minister?
Oh, well, I'm third generation, so my grandfather was too. What would you like to know about my father? I think he impacted me a lot more than I knew while it was happening, which the older I get, the better I realize that so much of who I am pastorally does come from my father because I watched him in this role in an analogous setting for so many years. I wasn't actively taking notes or paying attention. I just absorbed it. And so there are many times when I do things that I think, wow, a lot of dad in me, and some of my mom too. He was he grew up in a ministerial household. My grandfather had churches in the Midwest and then in Canada and on the East Coast. And my father grew up during the Depression and then during the Second World War and went off to Calvin College in the early 50s and then started ministry in Patterson in 1960. So it's a pretty amazing thing that when I'm getting hot, I turned the heater on. It's a pretty amazing thing that he took a job amongst African Americans when I imagine by virtue of growing up in Wisconsin and Minnesota and Iowa that he had zero personal experience with them. So it had to learn all of it when he moved to Patterson.
What things that you do as a pastor like remind you, make you think that that's like you have a lot of your dad in you?
I don't know if it's so much things I do because ministry has changed a lot since my father's pastorate, but it's much more um, a lot of the temperamental aspects that I think people pick up on, especially well in person, of course, but also on YouTube. Um, the high and openness, the patience, the warmth, the ability to love difficult to love people. I think those are some because and also just the my father attracted to himself. I mean, sometimes people look at this little corner of the internet and it's kind of the island of misfit toys. And that was very true of my father's ministries, especially his ministry in Patterson. A lot of people struggling with mental illness, but also a lot of people who were salt of the earth Christians who knew how to love difficult people. And that created a really special environment where that was never tremendously popular because difficult people are difficult to deal with. But for those who really have a heart for unusual people and an appetite for frankness and honesty, it's a lot of fun. And I absorbed all that from him.
What do you I don't know if there's one key, but what do you think is a key to loving difficult to love people?
I think one of the things, and again, I did get this from my father too, you have to know yourself and be comfortable with yourself. And you have to have a degree of security with yourself and your convictions. Part of why people run away from difficult and annoying people is that they get triggered. And it's not so much what other people are saying or doing, it's how that's destabilizing you at a deep level that makes people run away. Same thing goes with pain. Now we talk about mirror neurons. People don't like being around other people who are in pain because it makes them feel pain. And such a foundational part of ministry at just about every level is an ability to live with pain. And I think that's so central to Christianity, that the central symbol of Christianity is a man enduring pain and the pains of the world on a cross. That's the central symbol. And that's what it takes to love difficult to love people. You have to deal with your pain and their pain, and you have to stay in the pain.
Is that something you thought about before you became a pastor yourself?
No.
Okay.
No, this is all stuff that I began to realize as I before I became a pastor, I never intended to pastor a church like this, partly because I watched my father do it, and for, stupid reasons of my own, I didn't want to live my father's life after him. And I haven't, but in other ways I have. And it wasn't until really years into local ministry when I began to realize these things. And really a lot of these things, my father died in 2013 of a sudden heart attack. And a lot of this realization came after his death, where I could sort of see him with different eyes.
What ultimately made you want to be a pastor?
I didn't want to be a pastor.
Okay.
I started my career as a foreign missionary, and I very much intended to stay a foreign missionary, but some things happened in my life that brought us back to North America. And then I actually spent a year helping a rehab outfit in Grand Rapids, Michigan, teach therapists how to work on PCs and repairing PCs, because I picked up a lot of computer skills when I was in the Dominican Republic. And then after about a year of doing that, I realized I could get back into the ministry. And then I had a couple of job offers, and the one offer in Chicago was a staff position at a very nice church. And then I came out here and found a church. Actually, this church found me because they were first interested in calling my father. And my mother said, I'm not moving to the West Coast. We're going to stay on the East Coast. And then my father said to the church, well, I guess I can't come, but you can ask my son. And so I came out here, and, I had, as is common for pastoral search teams, I had a variety of meetings with members of the congregation, and they just, the people and the place just kind of warmed my heart, probably partly because it was similar to what I grew up with. And then, so the first day I came to work here, there was a homeless woman sitting in the parking lot. And that sort of, taught me a lot about the neighborhood. And I think a lot of people in the church were wary because of past ministers that, protect the minister from all of these homeless and mentally ill people. But to me, that was part of what drew me here. And so, whereas I never wanted to really be a local pastor, after a few years of doing it, I discovered I really enjoyed it. And I remember even as my father was in his last years of ministry, I had met some clergy who were in their last years of ministry, and they were bitter and, telling me things like they told their kids never to go into pastoral ministry because of all of the issues. And my father said, I've never loved it more. And he did. He always loved the church, and he always loved the people. And, he would have he would have been pastoring a church till the day he died if my mother had let him.
What do you love about it so much day to day?
I should say that I don't know that I would love pastoring churches with a, I don't know that I'd love pastoring churches that aren't like this one. And what I mean by that is there is a reality to this church that, and an honesty to it that is just so healthy. So this morning I posted on Twitter a link to my Freddie and Paul show 2016 Christmas extravaganza, where Freddie and I go out to McDonald's. And, you know, every Sunday, and many Sundays, we do the Freddie and Paul show with Freddie and Nancy and Phil, and sometimes some other people. And people here are not, they're playing their own games, but they're not playing the kinds of games that a lot of churches a lot of churches who have people in it that have something to lose play. There's something liberating about doing ministry among people who have either nothing left to lose or very little to lose, because there's just sort of an honesty and a freshness that helps us laugh at ourselves. I mean, I have a good time doing the show with Freddie and Nancy and others in the church, because when we take ourselves too seriously, when you have very little to lose, our pretense and our full of ourselvesness just gets exposed. And then suddenly, and to me, that's so central to what Jesus talks about in terms of being like the little children. That one of the most beautiful things I picked up from Eugene Peterson is, part of what coming to Christ means and how we do it best is when we come to him realizing, we have no one else and nothing else, and then to our delight we discover he's more than enough. And doing ministry in a place like this keeps you there. I think if I did ministry in a church with a lot of well put together people, and we're keeping up appearances.
So you kind of talked about this with honesty and stuff, but what do you think a more, quote unquote, nice church could learn from the kind of church that you pastor to?
That some of the disasters that terrify us can bring us closer to Christ and the gospel. Because the kinds of disasters that a lot of people are living with, and the truth is these come to everyone. It doesn't matter how wealthy you are or how good your health insurance is, it just delays the inevitable. I mean, the age of decay takes us all down. But hold the best Christians are the ones who have, like I just said, had everything taken away from them and discovered that in Christ they have more than they need and certainly more than they deserve. And you'll find those kinds of people in many different churches, but when you have a significant population of them in a church, that's what really makes the church a really good place to be, at least in my opinion.
So I don't mean this in like a manipulative way, but do you think that because the people around you tend to have less, do you think that enriches the faith that they do have? Do you think that builds the community more?
Yes. No question about it. Same the thing that I mentioned again when I was overseas. I worked with very poor people, and most of those people went to church every day. That was their life. And they had joy, they had community, they had sorrows. Don't get me wrong, if they could make their way to the United States and have a better life, they'd take it in a New York minute. But that, you know, everything that Christ says in the Gospels is true.
What do you think people that have a more luxurious or affluent life, what do you think they could learn from people who don't, that are still faithful?
I, the challenging part of that question is the word learning.
Okay, well, you can answer it however you'd like, or change the word if you'd like.
Well, because it's very difficult, and you find this in Jesus' parables about wealth. Everything Jesus says about wealth doesn't mean that wealth is a bad thing.
Mm-hmm.
And the Old Testament perspective on wealth is it's a gift from God. God blessed Abraham and Job and David, and he blessed them with wealth. But wealth tempts us into self-sufficiency, and it tempts us into trusting in our wealth. And I've known some very wealthy people who also knew their wealth was a gift from God to be used for the welfare of others, and they found a joy in using it that way. And so there was a guy in the Dominican Republic who came down, and he built a house for his family, and then he had this plan for helping poor Dominicans in an invasion area. That's what it means when people basically have a big land grab, and they put up little huts, and they don't have any money, but that's how they get a little bit of land and how they build a house. And it's basically an upward mobility strategy. And the people, so his plan was, he had made money in the United States, and he quit his job and he moved to the Dominican Republic, and he was kind of a contractor, so he knew how to do stuff. And his plan was, I'm going to put cement floors in the houses of poor people. And then, because they don't have the money for that, but that's super helpful for them, they can keep the house cleaner. It's a big deal for, if you're really poor, to get a cement floor in your house. And then they'll pay me back bit by bit. And then I'll use that money that gets paid back to put more cement floors in other people's houses. And I had been down there long enough that I said, it's a wonderful plan, but it's going to fail, because you're a wealthy gringo, and every Dominican knows you don't need this money to live. And there's no way in this political economic environment you could force them to pay you back, even if you wanted to. So you're never going to get any of this money back. And he said, to tell you the truth, I really don't care. And then he said, once you've made $1 million and lost $1 million, it's just money. And so he did that for a few years, ran out of money, had to go back to North America and get a job again to support his family once more. But there was nothing but joy in it for him. And, and this kind of Christian life is available to anyone. It really is. But all of the things that are standing in our way are in us. And so it's so often, I've never seen a Christian saint that hasn't suffered. It's part of the package. Christ uses suffering to make us saintly.
Could you kind of explain the idea of like denying yourself every day and taking up a cross?
I don't need to know, it needs a lot of explanation.
Like, yeah, I guess let me rephrase, like, how would you suggest someone does that who is like from a more affluent background? Like, I've been thinking about C.S. Lewis talking about like your real self is like a Christ self. I guess maybe that's a better way into this. Like, can you explain what that means? Like, what aspects of yourself you're trying to get rid of? What the Christ self would be?
Of myself.
Not
Well, it's
not
all
even
the
necessarily yourself, just in
yeah,
general.
it's all the usual suspects for most of us. It's security, it's wealth, it's indulgence, it's self-sufficiency. It's all of the things that we know we need. And so I would, if someone asked for advice, I'd say, well, take a Jordan Peterson approach and start small. And maybe there's something in your life that you think this would be a good thing to deny yourself. It's not a bad thing. It's something you're entitled to. It's maybe something everyone else is indulging in, but pick this one little thing and start denying yourself this thing. And that will probably begin to strengthen your ability to deny yourself in other ways. It's basic Christian formation that the church, I'm a Protestant, so I don't come from a fasting tradition, but if you're Orthodox or Roman Catholic, all of those fasting practices are if done properly. There are dangers in so Dallas Willard a number of years ago really sort of brought the whole spiritual formation thing to Protestants, as did Richard Foster. And they brought all of these riches of the Catholic and Orthodox monastic traditions to Protestants, and Protestants began doing them and using them, et cetera, et cetera. And there are dangers to all of them, but of self-pride and self-righteousness and all of those things. But all of that stuff is basically there to do exactly that, to begin to train us to deny ourselves. And in that self-denial, and that space that self-denial gives us, Christ forms us and actually makes us able to enjoy this joy of loving difficult people.
I've got to ask you, can you talk a bit about what C.S. Lewis's book Miracles means to you?
So part of my YouTube channel is journal/confessional. We live in a culture that is so deeply, the assumptions of secular materialism and naturalism are just so pervasive. And so part of what I'm always trying to do is not lose the Christian faith. I've seen many people I love around me, and many more who are, used to. I've seen so many people lose their Christian faith. And I believe a lot of this is just sort of the pervasive acid of secular materialism and all of these assumptions sort of just impacting us. And a lot of this came to the fore with the new atheists, and I got to the point where I knew I needed to do something to not lose my faith in this way, like I've seen so many do. And so I was, I'd read a lot of C.S. Lewis, but for some reason I picked up his book Miracles, and I started reading it, and things just began to click for me. And then after I read it, I'd been listening to Peter Kreeft, whose work I really like. And Peter's also from North Jersey, and also he grew up RCA, but went to my high school and my college before he went Roman Catholic. And so I was reading Kreeft, and he had some lectures on C.S. Lewis online, and I listened to those, and he talked about rereading C.S. Lewis. And so I started doing that with Miracles. And so I was reading the book 2 or 3 times a year. And then when Jordan Peterson sort of broke out onto the scene, I thought, oh, I'd love for Jordan Peterson to read this book. And so I was ready to pull up Amazon and, find out where I'd mail this to University of Toronto. And then another part of me thought, said, wait a minute. People give me books all the time that I never read. What makes me think he's going to read this thing? So then I decided that a much more subtle form of colonization was appropriate. He came to San Francisco to do an event. It was like one of these small events until, before he got really big. And I also noticed at the event that he had this whole staff. People came to the event with these books they were going to give him. And I thought, oh yeah, I'm glad I thought about this. So then I thought, if I want to actually colonize Jordan Peterson, I'm probably going to have to colonize a few more people along the way. And that wouldn't be a bad thing. And I'd like to have some conversations. So why not play around with YouTube? Who knows what could happen? And then Miracles was, of course, a big part of that. And I've talked about the book a lot. And maybe I should, some people have said, well, you should really do just a whole series on Miracles. And I probably should, but I'm so ADHD that I just had a conversation yesterday with Jordan B. Cooper, and I was looking at his channel. He's managed to do all of those series about philosophy and everything. And I look at that and say, wow, that's amazing. I wish I could do that. And people are like, of course you could. Well, I like doing what I'm doing now, so maybe I will do it someday. But Miracles, Lewis had a way of just cutting through. He had a way of exposing the insufficiencies of sort of the prevailing assumptions of modernity. Because Vervaeke talks about a meaning crisis, but Lewis and Tolkien, they had their meaning crisis at the beginning of the 20th century, along with all of Europe in the battlefields of World War I. And, he came back. He survived. He and Tolkien survived the war. Tolkien was a Christian. Lewis wasn't. Tolkien, of course, became a Roman Catholic. I don't think Lewis could ever do that, having been raised in Northern Ireland and the politics that were. So he became an Anglican. But Lewis could not stay an atheist. He can't do it. And so the way that the internet and our culture is basically spreading the meaning crisis means that we're going to continue to see exactly what we've been seeing, is that people are going to flee to the church for refuge, and they're going to keep doing it. And even, really embedded people like Jordan Peterson. So that's what's happening.
What does Paul Vander doubting his faith, what does it look like? Are there specific things that kind of play through your mind? Questions or lack of questions, I guess?
If I lost my faith, I definitely want to quit my job just to have some shreds of integrity. I don't have a lot of admiration for ministers who don't believe anymore, but stand up on Sunday and mouth words because they would lose their day job. I think I would become a hedonist. It would be, alcohol isn't my thing, but I think I'd wreck my family life. I think I'd indulge myself. That's what losing my faith would look like. And
sorry.
No, go ahead.
When you're questioning it, what kind of questions do you have?
I just listen to Sam Harris or Cosmic Skeptic, irrationality rules. You know, they articulate the, is this, can, does prayer make any sense? Can you actually believe the Bible? Did Jesus rise from the dead? And even if he did, so what? Is there anything beyond the grave besides the big sleep? I mean, all of that stuff is in me. And it's like how many of these pandemic movies where, it's like The Walking Dead, where everybody's got the zombie virus in them, and when they die, they turn. And so we've all got this virus in us from modernity. And so, the new atheists, they're just letting different members of my consciousness Congress out to talk in public, and people are, things get tipped, and people are like, yeah, I'm gonna leave the church. But when you really begin to look, but their day is ending too now, and but that doesn't mean that we're just going to break out into a time when churches are wonderful and full. And no, Lewis pegged it exactly right. We don't lack information. We don't need just a little bit of improvement. We're rebels who have to lay down our arms, and that's exactly what self-denial looks like.
So when you're in that period of doubt, what gets you? I mean, obviously C.S. Lewis's Miracles book, but what are the thoughts that get you out of that kind of new atheist mindset?
Basically, I get to a point, and Rafe Kelly really noticed this in what I do. I get to a point that I say, you know what? Let's say you're right. There is no God. We're all simply the product of emergent chaos. And for some reason, we got us unimaginably fortunate to have all of the cosmic constants dialed up right. And I wound up in one of the best centuries and one of the best places to live, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If it's all the product of chaos and physics, why not believe? Because what I also discover in my faith is that believing that what Christ has in store for me to reign with him in a new heavens and a new earth is true. It actually affords me to be the kind of neighbor that even the new atheist wants to have. If a new atheist moves into a house next door to me, he really wants me to keep my Christian faith. He really wants me to tell the truth and at least don't lie. He really wants me to do what's meaningful and not what's expedient. He really wants me to do all sorts of things, to be a good person in his words. And I know that part of me thinks, and he'll say, no, but if you gave up the faith, you wouldn't have to be a good person. And I'm like, but you're the rationality people. Why? If in fact I decide for some reason that it pleases whatever side of my nature to, I don't know, sleep with your wife or you rob your house when you're gone, if I decide that this pleases me and I can get away with it, isn't it rational for me to do this? Really? And so what I find is that, yes, the Christian life involves self-denial. Yes, it involves sometimes a strenuous commitment to keep it. But it also, for me, when I really believe it and believe into it, is a source of real joy and a source of real generosity in the way that the world says is really good, but seldom really achieves. So when I get to that point, it's like, all right, well, maybe you're okay. I'm still going to be a Christian. And in fact, I want my neighbors to be Christian too. So if it's the biggest lie ever told, on one hand, the Apostle Paul has a point. On the other hand, let's keep the lie going. And I know that there are a number of agnostics and atheists out there that have taken up that idea too. But I think actually for me to really believe it and really live into it is all the more blessed and happy. Because if in the back of my mind I didn't believe it, well then suddenly I'm sort of LARPing, and I you couldn't really pull it off. And it's actually those people who are at the point of, and I've met a lot of them, those people are at the point of they want to believe it, but they don't have the certainty, the plausibility isn't like deeply rooted. It's those people that I really have a heart for and really pray for, because, and then my advice for them is go to church. I think the only way you can maintain this belief, just from a basic human psychological perspective, is to live embedded in a community that also believe it. Because the truth is, we don't believe things as individuals, we believe things as bodies and collectives and communities. And so if you really want to believe, you gotta join and participate and, you know, keep pursuing a community around you that believes what you desire to believe.
Can you define faith?
Faith is leaning into, Christian faith is leaning into everything that Jesus teaches and promises for us.
And what do you mean by leaning into?
That's what's difficult in terms of a verbal thing. And this is what, so we get into the Vervaeke's 4 P's. It's participatory, it's perspectival, it's procedural. There is definitely the there is definitely the part where it's an is. We get that. It's propositional, but faith, and the reason why faith is so procedural, it's so perspectival, it's so participatory, that we're always trying to, like, we have, part of modernity is the belief, and it's before modernity too, and it'll live long, that if you can put it in a sentence, then somehow you've captured it. And I think deep in the Christian worldview says that the sentence will point to it. And that's why the Word of God is both a book, but that book points to the man, the Logos, who is the Word of God. And Jesus is that, and the Bible is the Word of God because Jesus is the Word of God.
Do you think that I kind of have 2 questions here, but I guess first, like, do you think that the participatory aspect of it, and just how, like, when you're talking about the Christian neighbor, do you think the way the Christian neighbor lives is evidence for the truth of the Christian neighbor's belief?
It can be. So I'm a Protestant and I remain a Protestant, but Protestants, part of the weakness of Protestantism is sometimes the same weakness of modernity, which is it's an over prioritization of the psychological. And this is sort of what Jordan Peterson gets at when he basically says to Sam Harris, yeah, but you're kind of a Christian too. Even if your neighbor doesn't go to church, even if your neighbor can't recite the Apostles' Creed, even if your neighbor isn't identifying as a Christian, there's a lot of Christianity in your neighbor that's been built up in him or her, and that they're living out, and is in many ways in our culture sort of masquerading under the guise of being a good person. And so I think, yes, if my neighbor became a better Christian, in other words, began to live into it better with all 4 P's, they would become even a better neighbor. but I praise God for the amount of Christianity that's in my neighbor. And I don't say that to somehow diminish my Jewish neighbor, or even, depending on what branch, my Muslim neighbor, atheist neighbors in America. My Hindu neighbor, the person right next door to church here, is actually a Hindu, and he's a wonderful neighbor. So a lot of this goodness is, by common grace, into the world. But I think the way that Christ began remapping our moral imaginations, and that this even spread around the world via secularism, which is sort of a weak crypto Christianity. It's still good, but yeah, turn it up. And it also doesn't mean that my Jewish neighbor can't morally outperform my Christian neighbor sometimes. The Apostle Paul, I think, is very clear about that in the first part of the book of Romans.
Do you think the insistence on like the sentence itself, like the rationalistic and everything, do you think that is the main issue in modernity that prevents people from having a more like developed Christian faith, is that they don't do the participative so much? Do you understand what I mean?
Yeah. I think our affluence is probably more to blame.
Why do you think
We're
that?
so rich, we're so secure. I was just preaching at Habakkuk last week, and there's this great line in Habakkuk where Habakkuk points out that he makes this analogy that the Babylonians, and the Babylonians in that moment stand in for empire: Egypt, Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome, Britain, America, all the empires. He makes this point that to the Babylonians, the people of the world are just fish in the ocean. They're nothing. And then he says that they sacrifice to their nets, and they burn incense to their hooks. In other words, their tools of war are their gods. That's where their faith is. It's an astounding thing that Habakkuk says. And yeah, it doesn't change. And Habakkuk, and the Lord says to Habakkuk that, yeah, the Babylonians, they're going to come down and they're going to, destroy you and your people, but they are also going to destroy themselves on wine and luxury and affluence. And so it's this, the Christians have long noted that Christianity and its self-denial can make you wealthy, but be careful of that wealth, because that wealth and affluence can send you back down to the bottom. And that's where we're at.
What do you think the way forward is then?
Well, you'd have to ask the way forward to what? And Christianity does have an eschatology, and I'm Dutch Reformed, so we're mostly Amil, as are the Catholics and the Lutherans and the Orthodox. It's a lot of the late modernist dispensationalists that came up with the pre-mill and the post-mill. Eschatology is a really interesting business, because on one hand, Christ has brought us so much and given us so much. I sometimes hear Orthodox and some Roman Catholics sort of, cursing the Enlightenment. And it's like, yeah, but I don't see you living without electricity or running water or sanitation or modern medicine. So don't complain too much while we all bear the blessings of it. And so those blessings are blessings of Christ. And in many ways, the Enlightenment was a blessing of Christ too. It was very much a mixed blessing, but I don't for a minute, I should be enormously grateful for the money that I have, the affluence that I live within. I live in one of the most amazing places at one of the most amazing times that a human being has ever lived. And I should thank God for that, because it is a gift from him. So forward, I hope that we continue to learn more with medical technology. I hope that we continue to learn more with science and technology. I hope that we, as we did during the Cold War, we don't destroy ourselves with all of this power that we are increasingly accumulating. But this cycle of, it's the cycle of empire that Habakkuk is talking about, but that cycle scales all the way down too, and it happens in our lives, and it happens in families. And so the challenge is always, how can we receive Christ and all of his benefits on one hand, while still maintaining the posture of empty-handedness coming to him? That's sort of the virtuous cycle of the Christian life, that we come to Christ with empty hands, and he fills them beyond what we can ask or imagine. But then and the answer is, keep giving it away. That's the answer. The rich young ruler comes to Christ and says, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus says, "Well, keep the law." And he says, "All these things I've done since a youth." And he says, "Okay, then go sell everything you have and follow me." But he doesn't step up to that challenge. And what? Let's say he sells everything he has and follows Jesus and becomes one of his inner ring who had to watch their master die on a cross because they absolutely couldn't comprehend everything Jesus was telling them beforehand, that it would happen. And none of them show up on Sunday morning at the gravesite because they certainly weren't understanding what he was saying. And then he comes back, and Acts chapter 1, "Now will you restore the kingdom to Israel? You don't get what I'm doing yet. I'm going to leave, and my Father's going to send his Spirit, and that Spirit has been doing it." But the disciples did what? Did any of them, maybe John, die of natural causes? I don't know. They went to foreign lands, they preached the gospel, they lived in poverty, but yet they didn't exchange it for, what that rich young ruler was unwilling to give up. So,
what advantages and disadvantages do you think Protestantism has over, say, Catholicism and Orthodoxy?
I think that the disadvantages are Protestants are fairly clueless when it comes to the deep power of symbolism and ritual. And we're seeing that right now in this whole space around Jordan Peterson and John Vervaeke and Jonathan Pageau. There are riches and depths of riches in Orthodoxy and Catholicism, and some brands of Protestantism have kept some of it. There are riches there that Protestants don't benefit from because of what we've done historically. I think some of the advantages of Protestantism are that people look at people leaving Protestant churches, but Catholics have had way more to lose, as have Orthodox, and have lost than Protestants. Rod Dreher has, made some observations, because he sort of went, raised a Methodist, sort of a nominal Methodist, went into Catholicism wanting it, to really lean in, discovered the hierarchy wasn't taking it as seriously as he was, so eventually went to orthodoxy and found more of what he was looking for. But he noted, yeah, but at least those Protestants know their Bible. At least those Protestants are showing a degree of communal discipline. At least those Protestants. So in some ways, Protestants have adapted to the changes in the world, and those adaptations offer them some advantages, but there are also some disadvantages. So I see Protestantism as sort of the skunk works, the experimental wing of the church. And I think, that certainly was true of the Protestant Reformation, where the whole, in many ways, the Protestant Reformation was a disaster. I mean, that was Lewis's perspective on it. Yeah, there were real things that needed to be addressed, but boy, we all went at it in a bad way, plunging Europe into blood. Still having the church just terribly divided. Okay, well, that didn't go well. But at the same time, in many ways, the Protestant Reformation helped save the Catholic Church from itself in many different areas. And the Catholic Church, when you read, what was going on in Catholicism in the late medieval period, I mean, the buying and selling of ecclesiastical office, the abuse, clergy abuse, all of this stuff. I mean, sometimes if you pull out that history and you read it, it's like, yeah, so the church needed really strong medicine, and the Protestant Reformation gave it. And I think as modernity wanes, Protestantism will continue to morph, but I think we're beginning to see the great traditions of the church do better together. And I hope that continues. Exactly what unity will look like, I don't know. Does it all have to be structural, hierarchical? And there's lots of different ways of going about that. And I think the Catholics have had their own experimentations and that sort of thing. So we're continuing, I think, to have a vivid, in real life experimentation of what unity means. And Protestants are part of that.
With this little corner of the internet, what do you think the most important issue is right now?
What this little corner of the internet is to me is our ability to create an ecosystem where people can, number one, more responsibly use the internet, meaning it's not going away. It's sort of like, at the beginning of the 16th century saying, man, I wish that printing press had never been invented. Look at the mess it's going to cause with the Protestant Reformation. The internet isn't going away. So we're going to have to learn to live with it. What's clear is that how we need to live with it is we need to find ways for the internet to enhance in real life community, not become a substitute for it. And what this little corner of the internet is on one hand an experiment in collective relevance realization. We are all thinking together about things. And if there's, the printing press had that same function. It's just sped up a lot with the internet and much more enriched. So we're doing that together. We're thinking together because together we're a lot smarter than we are alone. And in order to continue to do that at scale, what that means is we're going to continue to make a lot of smaller, interconnected communities that think together. And what that means is we're going to have to continue to play around with tools and find out what tools are good for what. So we've learned something about Discord. We've learned about YouTube. We're learning about all kinds of other tools. But the key of this is the personal relationships between the people. So I knew we were on the right track when, you know, some of the meetups in Chicago were organizing a little conference, and someone said to me, yeah, I was thinking of going to Chicago because you were going to be there. But then when I heard Chad the alcoholic was going to be there, I knew I had to go. And as a pastor, what I knew was that's a sign of health, because if it's a fandom, or if it's a cult of personality around me or Vervaeke or Peugeot or Peterson, that's not what we need. We need what churches do, which are networks of relationships, of valued relationships, where, yeah, you can know the priest, you can know the pastor, and maybe the priest knows you, and maybe the pastor knows you. But all of that individual personal growth is gonna come because you're friends with Chad the alcoholic, and you're friends with Jacob, and you're friends with Jeff, and you're friends with Job. So having it scale, and new people can come in and find their niche, and they can say, yeah, I used to watch Vander Klay, but I don't watch him much anymore, but I've got all these new friends now. That's what I want.
Well, I feel like that's a good place to end it, and I've taken up an hour of your time.
I was an hour already. This went fast. All
Yeah.
right.
So anyway,
Well, thank you much.
No, thank you so much. And yeah, I hope you have a good rest of the day.
All right. I hope this was worthwhile for you.
Definitely is super engaging.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. We'll talk to you later.
Yeah, see ya.
Bye.